I became a science teacher, and the first science lesson I had, the student said, "Sir, we heard you're a Christian." Well, I said, "Yes, that's true." "Well, how can you be a Christian when we know the Bible's not true?" I said, "How do you know the Bible's not true?" And then they pointed to their textbooks and all the evolutionary teaching. And right then I realized, you know what? These young people need answers. I need to show them I can defend my faith. And then a student said, and this is the first question I was asked, "So how could Noah get all the animals on the ark?" Noah couldn't get all the animals on the ark. Noah's ark can't be true. And I said, "How many animals did he need on the ark?" And the student said, "Well, I don't know." And I said, "Well, how big was the ark?" "Well, I don't know." I said, "Well, you have a problem. An unknown number of animals can't fit in an unknown size ark." Back then, in the late 70s, I cried out to the Lord and said, "Why can't we have a Christian museum that teaches the truth? Why can't we have a creation museum?" Just about everybody said, "Well, we don't know what to do with Genesis, and we don't know what to do about evolution, and what do you do?" And I thought, there is a great need here. And God gave me a burden that it is so hard to explain. We prayed in Australia, standing on a piece of property, "Lord, would you let us build a creation museum?" Here's the interesting thing, Chad. God answered that prayer, and we opened the Creation Museum in 2007 in Kentucky. And then in 2016, we opened the Ark Encounter.
Your father had a biblical worldview without the evidence, without the science, without the evidence.
They didn't have those answers in those days.
Then over the years, you get exposed to science, and a lot of scientists, a lot of people who are self-proclaimed scientists would say that science actually disproves the Bible, but your journey's been totally opposite. The more science you've uncovered, the more it's reinforced the truths of Genesis and the Bible.
The word science comes from the Latin scientia, which means to know. So it really means knowledge. And so when somebody says science versus the Bible, what do you mean? Knowledge versus the Bible? What do you mean? There's different sorts of knowledge. And this is why many people get confused on this issue. And I find even many pastors are confused on this issue because they don't understand what is meant by science. Because there's really a bait and switch in a way in the secular world. You can do experiments with metals and so on and find out their properties and so on, and we can build airplanes and so it goes on. But when it comes to talking about origins, that's a very different science. That's called historical science, because now you're talking about the past when you weren't there. You can't observe what's happening. It already happened in the past. That's a very different sort of science. And here's a problem. Many people, I find this with even many Christian leaders, think, well, wait a minute, science gave us all this great technology and I can drive a car and I can fly in a plane and I have computers. And so when these same scientists are telling me to believe in evolution of millions of years, if I don't believe that, I'll be rejecting the technology that, put man on the moon or that Elon Musk uses to, develop electric cars. Technologies based on observational science. When you're talking about origins, that's a whole different type of knowledge. It's a whole different type of science. So one of the things I've always tried to do is to teach people how to think correctly about science, how to think correctly about evidence, and where our worldview comes from.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how the study of archaeology and geology and science never debunks the Bible. It only continues to validate.
Continues to validate over and over again. A lot of people don't understand worldview. Where does your thinking come from? How do you interpret the evidence of the present? Everyone has beliefs that determine their worldview. And as a Christian, if we understand what the Bible is, a revelation from God who knows everything there is to know about everything, our worldview starts right there with that foundation to build our worldview. If you reject the Bible, then your foundation is basically man's word. Mm-hmm. And so there's really this foundational battle between God's word and man's word. And here at the Creation Museum, we take you through that as you start to walk through the exhibits. There's two foundations ultimately, two religions ultimately, God's word, man's word. Your worldview built on those foundations determines how you interpret evidence, whether it's geology, biology, astronomy, anthropology, whatever it is. Not only that, your foundation, building your worldview, then determines your morality. If there's no God, how do you determine right and wrong? You take generations through an education system and throw God out, the Bible out, prayer out, teach them that they're only animals, they evolve by chance random processes. What are you going to see? You're going to see moral relativism permeate their thinking, permeate the culture. Therefore, marriage is however you want to define it. Why not abortion, get rid of spare cats, get rid of spare animals. We're just animals anyway. Why does it matter? Who determines what's good and what's evil, what's good and what's bad? You start from God's word. Well, God created everything. He defines everything. So he defines marriage, a man and a woman. He defines right and wrong. He tells us what's right and what's wrong. He defines gender. He made two to start with, male and female. He defines life. You realize an atheist can't actually have a consistent worldview. They always have to borrow from the Christian worldview. So when an atheist then talks about certain things are right or wrong or what's good or what's evil, because if you're truly an atheist, there's no God, then everything's relative.
Sure.
There are no absolutes, and therefore anyone has a right to do whatever they want. You're totally inconsistent if you tell someone you can't do this or you shouldn't do this, or that murder is wrong, or that anything is wrong. Ultimately, there's nothing that ultimately is not founded in Genesis 1 to 11.
Yeah.
Genesis 1 to 11, it's the history in geology, biology, astronomy, anthropology, that's foundational to everything. When God killed animals, he gave coats of skins to Adam and Eve. It's the origin of clothing. It's why we wear clothes. First blood sacrifices are covering for our sin. Set up the sacrificial system, but an animal's blood can't take away our sin. Hebrews makes that very clear. And there has to be the shedding of blood for the remission of sins, because the life of the flesh is in the blood. And because blood represents life, therefore, when death was the penalty for sin, that's why we die, by the way, the origin of death. Adam, if you take this fruit, you will surely die. And then because you took this fruit, because you disobeyed, your body will now return to dust, right? And our body does return to dust. When it comes to marriage, I see so many Christian leaders softening their view on LGBT because of the culture, but God's word never changes. What we should be doing is standing on God's word and challenging the culture. The culture changes, but God's word never changes. In the beginning, God, who is one but more than one, created the heavens, space, and the earth, matter, the space, mass, time continuum that he brought into existence. I've had people even say to me, well, surely things would have to be billions of years old, because what was God doing for all that time before he created? But the thing is, there was no time. He created time. We exist in time. He does not.
With the structure of the continents around the time of the flood, we talk about a catastrophic event. Are you of the belief that prior to the flood, there was one mass of land?
Yeah. In fact, when you look at day 3 of Creation Week, when God said he raised up the land, he said he gathered the waters into one place, the implication then is the land was in one place. And it's interesting, you have the secular world talking about continental drift, where the continents split up supposedly over millions of years and so on. Actually, the first person to talk about one continent splitting up was a creationist, before evolutionists ever did. And we believe that the continents split up as a result of the flood.
In one catastrophic event.
A catastrophic event. So, there still is some movement, but we'd say that's residual movement from the catastrophic event, whereas evolutionists interpret it as ongoing, small, drifting over millions of years.
Well, this helps answer your student's questions back in 1975 when he said, how do you get all the animals in the ark? If they're from a multitude of continents across oceans, that makes it much more difficult than if all the animals would have been on one landmass.